They didn't announce it. They didn't issue a press release or hold a news conference or give the international media the kind of advance notice that would have allowed the Iranian security apparatus to prepare, to reinforce, to reposition the assets that were about to become targets. They move the way people move when they have been planning something for a very long time and have finally decided that the moment has arrived. Quietly, purposefully, and with the specific confidence that comes not from recklessness, but from preparation so thorough that the outcome has already been war-gamed in the minds of the people executing it hundreds of times before the first fighter took his first step toward the Iranian border. When the sun came up over the Zagros Mountains on the morning that changed the calculation in Tehran, the Iranian commanders responsible for the western border region were looking at a situation that their planning had not adequately prepared them for. Not because the possibility of Kurdish military action had been unanticipated, it had been anticipated. It had been war-gamed and assessed and briefed up the Iranian chain of command in reports that described the threat in appropriately serious terms. What had not been adequately prepared for was the scale, the coordination, the specific targeting logic that demonstrated an intelligence picture of Iranian military dispositions in the western provinces, more detailed and more current than the Iranian security apparatus believed any external organization possessed, and the speed with which thousands of fighters moving simultaneously across multiple axes created facts on the ground that the Iranian response, slower and thinner than it should have been, could not immediately reverse. What thousands of Kurdish fighters just did to Iran is one of the most significant military and political developments of this entire conflict, and it has received a fraction of the attention it deserves because the international media's focus has been almost entirely on the naval and nuclear dimensions of the broader confrontation. But the people in Tehran who understand the full picture of what is happening to the Iranian state right now are not primarily worried about the naval dimension tonight. They are worried about the western provinces. They are worried about what the Kurdish operations reveal about the current limits of Iranian military capacity. And they are worried about something deeper and more consequential than any individual military setback, which is what these operations tell the Iranian population and the Iranian military's own rank and file about the regime's ability to maintain control over its own territory at a moment when its authority is being challenged from more directions simultaneously than at any point since the revolution that brought it to power. That is the story we are going to tell today. The full story, with the depth and the honesty and the human dimension that it deserves, told through three people whose experiences illuminate what is actually happening in those mountains and what it means for everything that comes next. The first is Commander Sirwan Barzani, a senior military figure within the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran's armed wing, whose operational planning contributed directly to what just unfolded in the western border region. Sirwan is not a household name outside of the specific world of Iranian Kurdish politics and the defense and intelligence communities that monitor it, but within those communities, his reputation as an operational planner who combines deep local knowledge with a sophisticated understanding of conventional military principles and unconventional environments has been growing for years. The operations that just shocked Tehran bear his fingerprints in specific ways that people who understand Iranian Kurdish military doctrine can identify, and understanding his approach to the planning helps explain why the execution achieved effects that exceeded what most outside assessments of Iranian Kurdish military capability had predicted was achievable. The second is Brigadier General Hassan Shabazi, the Iranian army officer commanding the ground forces garrison responsible for a significant portion of the western border region, where the Kurdish operations have been most consequential. Shabazi is a professional soldier in the conventional Iranian army, the Artesh, rather than the IRGC, a distinction that matters enormously for understanding his situation and the constraints he is operating under. The Artesh and the IRGC have always existed in a relationship of institutional competition and mutual suspicion within the Iranian military system, with the IRGC commanding greater resources, greater political favor from the regime's leadership, and greater operational authority in the areas that the regime considers most strategically sensitive. When Kurdish fighters began putting real pressure on the positions Shabazi's forces are responsible for defending, the resources and the reinforcement he needed to respond effectively ran into exactly the institutional dynamics of the Iranian military system that have always made the Artesh's operational position more difficult than its formal responsibilities would suggest. The third is Nechavan Barzani, the president of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, whose territory provides the geographic and political context within which the Iranian Kurdish operations are being conducted, and whose own calculations about how to manage the relationship between the Kurdistan region's interests and the operations of Iranian Kurdish armed groups operating from or through Iraqi Kurdish territory reflect some of the most complex political judgments being made by any actor in this entire situation. Nechervan occupies a position of extraordinary strategic sensitivity, simultaneously responsible to the Iraqi federal government in Baghdad, dependent on relationships with Turkey, Iran, and the United States that carry contradictory pressures, and deeply connected by bonds of Kurdish solidarity to the aspirations that the Iranian Kurdish operations represent. His navigation of those competing pressures is shaping the operational environment in ways that are not fully visible from the outside, but that matter enormously for understanding what the Kurdish fighters who just moved against Iran are actually able to sustain. Begin with Sirwan Barzani and the planning that produced the operations, because the sophistication of the execution is the most important thing to understand about what just happened and why it represents something qualitatively different from previous rounds of Iranian Kurdish military activity. Sirwan has spent the better part of a decade doing something that receives almost no outside attention, but that turns out to have been one of the most consequential investments any actor in this conflict has made in preparation for the current moment. He has been systematically building an intelligence picture of Iranian military dispositions in the western border provinces that goes far beyond anything the Iranian security apparatus believed any external organization was capable of maintaining. Not through technical collection means that require the kind of resources only state-level intelligence agencies command. Through the patient, meticulous cultivation of human networks within the affected regions, networks built on the family and tribal connections that cross the Iranian-Iraqi Kurdish border in ways that no amount of Iranian border security infrastructure has ever fully severed, and that provide current, granular, operationally specific information about Iranian military positions, garrison strengths, supply routes, communications infrastructure, and command relationships that constitutes exactly the targeting picture needed to plan operations of the scale and the precision that just occurred. The intelligence picture that Sirwan brought to the operational planning for the current operations reflected years of collection through those networks, continuously updated and verified through multiple independent sources in ways that gave him a level of confidence in its accuracy that the operational results have now validated. When Kurdish fighters moved against specific Iranian border posts and administrative infrastructure in the opening phase of the operations, they moved with knowledge of those positions, their garrison strengths, their defensive arrangements, and their reinforcement timelines that allowed the attacks to be timed and sequenced for maximum effect. Positions were hit before their reinforcements could arrive, because the planning had accounted for the reinforcement timelines with enough accuracy to ensure the timing. Communications infrastructure was disrupted before isolated positions could call for help because the planning had identified the specific nodes that needed to be addressed. The simultaneity of pressure across multiple axes was coordinated with enough precision to prevent Iranian commanders from concentrating their available response forces against any single point of pressure. This is not the operational signature of an organization improvising against an opportunity. It is the operational signature of an organization that has been planning a specific operation against a specific target set with specific objectives for an extended period, and has executed that plan with the kind of disciplined professionalism that serious operational preparation produces. General Shahbazi encountered the results of that preparation in the most direct possible way, as the commander whose forces were on the receiving end of operations that demonstrated they had been studied, analyzed, and planned against, with a thoroughness that his own intelligence picture had not led him to anticipate. The Iranian military's assessment of Iranian Kurdish military capability, which had been built on historical precedent and on collection against the observable indicators of Kurdish organizational capacity, had underestimated the specific operational sophistication that Sirwan's planning represented. Shahbazi's forces were not poorly trained or poorly motivated in the individual sense. They were operating against a plan that had been built specifically around their specific vulnerabilities, and the gap between the planning sophistication on the Kurdish side and the defensive preparation on the Iranian side reflected a disparity in intelligence quality that no amount of individual fighting quality could fully compensate for. The reinforcement problem that Shahbazi faced in the hours following the initial Kurdish operations was the most immediate and most consequential constraint on his ability to respond effectively. In a normal period of Iranian military capacity, the western border region would have been able to draw on rapid reaction forces capable of arriving within hours to reinforce positions under pressure and execute counterattacks that could reverse initial Kurdish gains before they could be consolidated. The current period is not a normal period of Iranian military capacity. The units that would normally provide that rapid reaction capability have been affected by the attrition of the broader conflict, by the redeployment of some forces to other priority missions, and by the resource competition that the overall strain on the Iranian military budget has imposed on every component of the force. Shahbazi's requests for reinforcement were not ignored. They were processed through a system that was simultaneously managing multiple other urgent demands, and the response was slower and thinner than the situation required. The institutional dimension of Shahbazi's problem, the fact that he commands Artesh forces in a region where the IRGC exercises the primary authority over strategic decisions, added a layer of bureaucratic friction to the already constrained response capacity. When the initial Kurdish operations made clear that the situation was more serious than the initial assessments had suggested, the decision-making about how to respond involved coordination between Artesh and IRGC chains of command that do not communicate with the seamless efficiency that crisis management requires. Resources that Shahbazi needed were controlled by IRGC commanders, who had their own priorities and their own assessments of the situation that did not always align with Shahbazi's operational judgments. The resulting response, while real and while imposing genuine costs on Kurdish forces, was less coherent and less decisive than it needed to be to reverse the initial Kurdish gains before they could begin to be consolidated. Nachirvan Barzani was watching all of this from Erbil, the capital of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, managing a set of pressures that would have been challenging under any circumstances, and that the current situation had made considerably more acute. The Kurdistan region's relationship with Iran has always been one of the most delicate and most consequential external relationships it manages, because Iran shares a long border with the region, has significant influence over Kurdish political factions within Iraqi Kurdistan, and has historically demonstrated a willingness to use economic pressure, political interference, and in extreme cases, direct military action to influence the behavior of the Kurdish regional government in ways that serve Iranian interests. In the current situation, with Iranian Kurdish armed groups conducting operations into Iran from or through territory within or adjacent to the Kurdistan region, Nachirvan's management of that relationship had become one of the most consequential political balancing acts in the entire regional situation. Iran was demanding that he act to prevent the Kurdistan region from being used as a base for operations against Iranian territory. The Iranian Kurdish organizations conducting those operations were asserting aspirations that connected directly to the Kurdish solidarity that gives the Kurdistan region its deepest political identity. The United States, whose relationship with the Kurdistan region has been one of the most consistently positive American relationships in the broader Middle East, was watching developments with an interest that included both the strategic implications of Iranian Kurdish military pressure on a weakened Iranian state and the regional stability considerations that make uncontrolled escalation in the border region a concern regardless of which side it benefits. Nachirvan's navigation of those pressures has been characterized by the same careful, patient, long-view political judgment that has defined his leadership of the Kurdistan region through multiple previous crises. He has not moved to actively suppress the Iranian Kurdish operations, which would require using Kurdistan region security forces against fighters who represent aspirations that his own population largely sympathizes with, and which would damage the Kurdistan region's relationship with the Iranian Kurdish community in ways that would have long-term political consequences. But he's also not openly endorsed or actively facilitated the operations in ways that would give Iran a clear justification for the kind of direct retaliation against Kurdistan region interests that Iranian officials have threatened in various back-channel communications. The political tightrope he is walking reflects a calculation that the current moment, with Iran militarily degraded and diplomatically isolated to a degree without precedent in the post-revolutionary period, creates an opportunity for a different kind of Kurdish regional political outcome that would not be well served by either openly supporting operations that could provoke Iranian retaliation against Kurdistan region interests, or actively suppressing them in ways that would damage the Kurdish solidarity that is the Kurdistan region's deepest political foundation. The Iranian population's awareness of what is happening in the western provinces is another dimension of the story whose significance is difficult to overstate. The regime's control of information about the Kurdish operations has been intensive and reflected a clear understanding of the domestic political implications of accurate public knowledge about what is actually happening on the ground. State media coverage has minimized the scale of the operations, attributed them entirely to foreign-backed terrorism, and emphasized Iranian security force successes, while omitting or minimizing the setbacks and the territorial losses that have characterized the actual ground situation. But the regime's ability to maintain that information environment has been eroding throughout this conflict, as the combination of smartphone penetration, diaspora networks, and satellite communications has made the gap between official narrative and observable reality increasingly difficult to sustain. People in the Kurdish provinces who are living the reality of what is happening, who are seeing Kurdish fighters operating in areas where the regime's security forces have not been visibly present in years, who are watching the Iranian state's authority over specific areas of their daily lives contract in real time, are sharing what they are seeing through the channels that the regime cannot fully control. And the picture that is emerging through those channels, filtered and incomplete as any picture from a restricted information environment necessarily is, describes a situation that is more significant than anything the official Iranian media has acknowledged. The significance of that public awareness, even partial and imperfect, lies in what it does to the narrative that the regime depends on for its domestic legitimacy, The Islamic Republic has always rested part of its claim to authority on its demonstrated ability to maintain security and territorial integrity within its borders. A regime that cannot control its own western provinces, that is visibly struggling to respond to a Kurdish military challenge with the overwhelming force that previous Iranian governments have brought to bear against similar challenges, is a regime whose authority narrative is being challenged in the most concrete possible way. The people watching that challenge unfold, including the members of the Iranian military's own rank and file who are aware of what is happening in the western border region, even when their families and neighbors are not, are drawing their own conclusions about what the current situation says about the regime they serve. Shahbazi is one of the people managing that awareness within his own command, trying to maintain the morale and the operational effectiveness of forces that are under genuine military pressure, while simultaneously navigating the information environment that the regime requires him to maintain for his troops. The gap between the operational reality his forces are experiencing and the official narrative about that reality is one of the most corrosive things a military commander can manage, because it creates a foundation of shared awareness of official dishonesty that undermines the trust between leadership and lead that military effectiveness depends on. The international dimension of what is happening in Iran's Kurdish regions is being watched with varying degrees of attention and concern by every government with interests in the region. The United States government's public position has been carefully calibrated to avoid either endorsing the Kurdish operations or condemning them, reflecting a policy calculation that the operations are creating strategic pressure on an Iranian regime whose military and political exhaustion serves American strategic interests without requiring any direct American involvement that would complicate the diplomatic track or create escalation risks that the current careful management of the conflict is designed to avoid. That calculated American non-position is itself a form of support, because it denies Iran the ability to frame the Kurdish operations as simply an extension of American military pressure, and therefore to mobilize the nationalist response that such framing might generate. The Iranian regime has tried to make exactly that framing stick, attributing the Kurdish operations to American and Israeli instigation in ways that are designed to delegitimize them domestically and to build international pressure on the United States to rein in what Iran is characterizing as proxy warfare. The careful American neutrality on the question has limited the effectiveness of that framing in ways that serve the strategic outcome that the overall pressure campaign is designed to produce. What Sirwan Barzani's operations have achieved militarily is significant and real. Territory in the western border region that had been under uncontested Iranian control has been contested and in some cases changed hands. Iranian administrative infrastructure in specific areas has been disrupted in ways that have practical implications for the regime's ability to exercise its authority in those areas. The Iranian military's reputation for overwhelming responsiveness to challenges to its territorial control has been damaged in ways that will be noted by every other actor calculating what Iranian military capacity can and cannot do in the current period. And the psychological impact on Iranian military and political decision-makers of watching thousands of Kurdish fighters operate within Iranian territory with a freedom of movement and operational effectiveness that the Iranian response has been unable to eliminate is a form of strategic pressure whose importance goes beyond its immediate military dimension. But Sirwan also understands, with the honest clarity that serious operational commanders bring to their own achievements, that what has been accomplished in this phase of operations is the beginning of a challenge rather than the resolution of one. The Iranian state has not abandoned its western provinces. It has been unable to respond to the current challenge with its full historical capacity, but that capacity, however degraded, has not been eliminated. As the broader conflict continues, and as Iranian military reconstitution proceeds, however slowly and however constrained by the overall pressure of the situation, the gap between the challenge that the Kurdish operations represent and the Iranian capacity to respond will narrow in ways that will change the operational environment. The consolidation question, what the Kurdish organizations can build in the space that the military operations have opened in terms of governance, popular support, and organizational infrastructure that goes beyond the military domain, will ultimately determine whether the current moment produces lasting change or becomes another episode of Kurdish military achievement that the Iranian state eventually reverses. Sirwan knows this, Nechirvan knows this, and the international actors watching from various distances and various degrees of investment in the outcome know this as well. The story of what thousands of Kurdish fighters just did to Iran is not finished. It is in its early and most consequential chapters, the chapters in which the military achievement either gets consolidated into something durable or gets reversed by the Iranian state's eventual reconstitution of its response capacity. The people writing those chapters are operating in one of the most complex and most consequential strategic environments in the modern history of the Kurdish political struggle, with more external variables bearing on the outcome of their efforts than at any previous moment in that struggle. What they have already achieved is more than any previous generation of Iranian Kurdish fighters has achieved in terms of demonstrating the limits of Iranian military capacity and the possibilities created when those limits are exposed at a moment of genuine Iranian weakness. What they do with that achievement and what the world does with what they have made possible will be the question that defines whether this moment stands out in the long history of Kurdish aspirations as the one that finally mattered in the ways that mattered most. The mountains are theirs right now in ways they have not been for decades. How long they remain that way and what changes because they were is the story that is still being written in those high, cold passes where thousands of Kurdish fighters made their move and changed the calculation in a capital that never thought they could.